Hey, how you doing? My name is Richard Dolan from Check Your Head UK. I work with people to help them explore, understand and overcome their mental health issues. I had a really great conversation with Carl and Luke from the Featuring Regular People podcast about men's mental health, male stereotypes, social media and how the pandemic has affected us all. If you want to hear a really good conversation on those topics, make sure that you download the latest episode of their podcast. It's not going to disappoint. Take care of yourselves, each other, and I'll see you there.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for tuning back into this is episode number 7 now of Featuring Regular People. So yeah, thank you so much for tuning back in tonight. We're excited for this episode to come out. But first and foremost, as I always do whenever I start the podcast, is please check out all our social media. So at Featuring Regular People on Instagram and Facebook, Featuring Regular People on Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts as well. Today, our guest is Richard Dolan, who's an ambassador for Let's Get Men Talking and works as an integrative therapist. So you can find all his social media at Check Your Head UK, and his website is checkyourhead.co.uk. But as we always do, we'll post the links down at the bottom anyway. So Rich, thanks for coming on, mate. It's nice to meet you.
No, thanks for having me. Nice to meet you guys too.
We're excited to have you on. Obviously, this is a quite a nice topic. Well, in some ways, it's a nice topic to be able to kind of talk about and find out more. But if you could give us an introduction, a brief overview of who you are, what you do, etc.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm an integrative therapist, which basically means that I blend several different theoretical approaches to deliver counselling, mental health support.
Yeah.
I work with people of all ages, all genders, but predominantly just by virtue of the people that are coming to me at the moment, I tend to work more with men. And as a result of that, I've been quite active in the men's mental health space. This is something that I'm sure as men yourselves will be aware is becoming, something that's quite rightfully being spoken about an awful lot more. Just going to put it out there right at the beginning in that middle-aged men were the biggest suicide risk at the moment. It's something that is a big problem and needs more attention drawn to it. So one of the things that I do as a result of being on Instagram is, as you pointed out, work as an ambassador for Let's Get Men Talking, which is very much, as it says on the tin, about getting men talking.
Yeah. Sorry, mate. I was just going to say that's a really good platform. Like that's obviously like the reason we're excited to do this podcast. And you say like it's a nice subject. Like obviously it's not, but like it's nice to be able to talk about it. And I think Let's Get Men Talking as a platform, it offers like people the opportunity to talk in like a comfortable, like safe environment.
Yeah, I think that's something that people have. Certainly, men. And I think it's important to make the distinction at the beginning that men's mental health is no more or less important than women's or children's or anybody's mental health. But I think that traditionally, counselling, therapy, whatever you want to call it, has been a kind of an easier place for women to access. And those kind of conversations are difficult for men to have because of the way society is. So platforms like Let's Get Men Talking, and there's many others out there, the Proper Blokes Club, too many to mention. What you've got to just do is search men's mental health on Instagram and you'll come up with a whole bunch of them. But what they are doing is creating, as you said, safe spaces where people can start to feel comfortable to talk about how they feel, which traditionally has not been something that men have done.
Absolutely.
No, absolutely. I mean, we'll jump back into that shortly as well, because there's so many different kind of aspects that that we can touch on. But for those people out there, and I mean myself and Khan included in that, I very much know what things like CBT are. I've gone through that kind of myself as well. But just for people that aren't as familiar with the term integrative therapy, what is it, and why do you think this is such an effective approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the reasons that it's so confusing and puts people off going to a therapist or looking into it is because there's so many different types, there's so many different therapists out there. It's quite a saturated market. So it's really helpful, I think, to be able to explain, what different types of therapy there are. So my integrated approach blends It does take CBT in as well, but it takes three kind of core models. The first being what's called person-centered counselling. And it, again, kind of what it says on the tin, it is very much about the focus on the individual, about their worth and their value, and the belief in that person's ability to overcome and resolve whatever issues that they're facing. It bases its approach on empathy and, you know, congruence, which is being absolutely real and absolutely genuine in that therapeutic relationship. And quite often the conditions that are created in that relationship are such that the person coming to therapy might never have experienced in their life. You know, so we're talking about people who've perhaps grown up without feeling love, without, you know, being kind of nurtured, without being cared for, without, you know, being treated in the way that, you know, you or I would you know, like to be treated, with respect and love and care. Just having those things present in a relationship can be incredibly powerful in getting somebody to be able to connect with what's going on for them, and, you know, understand how they can overcome whatever challenges they're facing. The other two models would be transactional analysis, which is, you may have come across this. It's been sort of diluted, and it appears in various different forms in, you know, all kinds of sort of self-help stuff and you know, business coaching, everything. But it works on the basic premise that we've got three what are called ego states, which is the parent, the adult, and the child. So we kind of move between those depending on who we're talking to, or what situation we are in within life. And I'm sure you could probably all relate to situations where you've spoken to somebody and you know, they perhaps responded, had a little bit of a tantrum, maybe, you know, throwing their toys out the pram. You know, so what that person's doing is they're going into their child mode, and then what you might do is you might then change your method of communication and be a bit more parental, you know, and kind of in a way that a parent might admonish a child. So what we're all really striving for with that model is to exist in the adult, which is where we speak to each other on equal, and we communicate on an equal platform, and we receive, you know, messages around us in a way which doesn't trigger us into, you know, either responding defensively or kind of having a bit of a tantrum. So it uses those kind of concepts to be able to help us understand how we navigate through life and how our relationships work and how we communicate. And then the final model that I use is called Gestalt, which is much more about how you feel in the here and now. So it might be that we're looking at something, a particular problem or issue that's going on, and rather than going back and looking at how you felt at the time, it might be more about how you feel right now when you're talking about it. What's going on for you now? Are you feeling anger? Are you kind of, you know, how is that affecting you in the moment when you're thinking about or talking about something? And it looks at a person as a whole. So it's not just the presenting issue. It's, you know, their age, their sex, their culture, any spiritual elements, you know, their environment. It looks at every aspect of that person. So it doesn't just isolate one particular thing. So integrative therapy is about taking, you know, those models and blending them to draw upon the parts that are most relevant to whatever it is that the person you're working with needs, because that is ultimately the goal. Is about being flexible and adaptive to meet the needs of that client, rather than being prescriptive in the way that you work. So I know that was a long answer, but I hope that makes sense.
No, it does. I think it's absolutely fascinating because, you know, a lot of the time they do this in the self-help books. I read a lot of self-development books, and I think sometimes they try to, you know, give these snappy answers, which can often be detrimental to the way that you think. You know, they say, even the terms like man up, you don't really see that one anymore in the self-development books that I'm reading. But, you know, lots of like quick phrases, you know, pull your socks up, get on with it, or just think positively. And it's like, there is so much more, and there is so much more substance to everything other than just that.
Definitely. I think you've hit upon something really, really key there, in that we as a society have started to lean more towards, you know, easily consumable bite-sized chunks. And, you know, Instagram is a great platform to demonstrate that. Everybody wants something in an easily consumable meme or an image that they can just tap like. They don't have to really read too much or think too much about it. So from a mental health perspective, there's been a huge explosion in pages which are about condensing all of this kind of information that might happen over the course of several therapy sessions into a few sort of graphics or pictures that are, as you say, kind of tips, tools, tricks, techniques, and a lot of it's really, really good. But I think when somebody's in a position of emotional vulnerability and they need to, what they actually need is to be held, to have a safe space created for them where they can process their emotions and actually kind of work through it. What isn't perhaps helpful is a bunch of, kind of buzzwords or catchphrases or things like that, because that's not necessarily helping them connect with what's going on. And that's definitely something I'm seeing more of. And I think you can only reduce what therapy is so much before it becomes, too diluted.
Obsolete.
I think then it just makes me my head's just flooded with them little quotes you see. It's like a picture of a sunset, and then it's some generic quote about being positive or things will get better. And at any time in my life where I've been struggling or anything like that, if I see something like that, it just makes me angrier. Because it's just it's such a blanket statement. And for some people, I'm sure they can look at a few things like that and it kind of does make them feel a bit better. But for me, it's I don't know, it's just it's so broad and it seems really unhelpful. But
it's how do you do it,
Absolutely. And if you look on my page, you'll see a few things just like that. And the reason I haven't taken them down is I haven't been on Instagram very long. I never really used social media much before I decided to use it for my practice. And what I've really struggled with is that there's so many pages out there that do exactly just that, Carl, that you just talked about, that are just kind of lovely images and quotes, self-affirmation, positive affirmation, things like that. What I do is I use predominantly film quotes from films that mean something to me, and then I use the quote as a way to write about something from a mental health perspective, but not necessarily using kind of jargon and stuff. And what I found is that people don't really want, on Instagram, they don't really want something they have to spend a lot of time reading. They want something shiny and pretty. They can go, lovely picture, lovely quote. They don't necessarily want something that requires them to spend 5 minutes reading and thinking about it. So what I've found is I've got less engagement on that sort of stuff, whereas I've seen some pictures I've put out. So my brother Martin Dolan Photography, check him out, anybody watching this, fantastic landscape photographer. So I've used some of his images and I've used some quotes, and I've had some of my most engaged posts with those, where I've got what I feel is a fairly well crafted, informative, useful post that has got less than half that engagement because it doesn't look pretty and shiny. And Instagram is about how something looks. It's not where someone goes to spend 5 or 10 minutes reading something. So I think what you've hit upon there, Khan, is really relevant, in that there are people out there who genuinely need help and want help, and what they're faced with is just a bombardment of these kind of twee quotes, which I think for a lot of people are quite patronizing, because they're like,
hit the nail on the head.
But having said that, there are also people that draw strength from them, and I think that what it is doing, and I spoke about this on another podcast the other day, what it's doing is it's making mental health and the support and the understanding around it much more accessible to people, because it's here and we carry these all the time. Whereas before, all of that used to be in the in the arms of the experts, and you had to go to the doctor or to the therapist, and through various barriers that prevented people from even thinking about it. So
absolutely,
it's up and down, but I think that there is a risk that people can take a lot of that stuff that we're talking about and think, oh yeah, all I've got to do is this, or these 3 tips, and I'll be okay. And it doesn't work like that.
I wish it was that simple, but there's a few more questions that I want to touch on social media shortly. But I wanted to go, as we've kind of discovered already that you're a big advocate for men's mental health in particular. Why is it that you kind of went down that pathway? And, is there more to it than the fact that just, you are a man? So that's what you wanted to focus on, or what was the kind of inspiration for that?
It's a good question, and one I've been asked actually just today. I was asked by my supervisor. So as part of being a therapist, you have a supervisor, and that's really someone that checks that you're practicing ethically, and it's for you to be able to take any challenges that you have. Perhaps something comes up in the client work that maybe affects you on a personal level, and you need somewhere to take that to make sure that it doesn't factor into how you work. So we go to supervisors, and we were talking about this, and they asked me, I said, do you not think, and someone else asked me this the other day too, and I'm sure someone will ask me next week, you're not worried that you're that you're excluding women by focusing on men. And my response was that is a risk, but I always felt that I would never try to be all things to all clients, because there's jack of all trades, master of none. I wanted to be the best therapist that I'm able to be, and therefore the people that do choose to work with me, I can be the best therapist that I can be for them. And what I've found throughout my journey is that it is a female-dominated, profession for the most part, and that means that if you were to go online now and look at either one of the main directories or anything like that, you would be faced with mostly female counsellors. So for a guy who perhaps wants to talk about something that is unique to being a man, or because of the issues which we'll expand upon, finds it difficult to talk about things anyway, they might want to talk to somebody that they can look at and think, yeah, he looks like me, or he looks like he might understand me, rather than someone that perhaps reminds them of their mum or their gran or their auntie or a teacher at school. So what I've found is that I've had men coming to me without really kind of trying to market myself there. So it tells me that there is a demand for that, and that the men that have sought me out have obviously felt comfortable in being able to work with me. So it's kind of like going where the demand is. This is what I'm doing. I'm meeting the demand that's out there. But increasingly, I've become quite passionate about the fact that I don't think that the therapeutic world serves men as well as it could do. So if I've got a responsibility to play my part in that, I want to, kind of live up to that responsibility in doing the best that I can to meet the need that's out there. So I think that the one thing that I can do is relate to my own experience as a man in a world at the moment, which I think it's fair to say is quite confusing to be a man. So, it's about sort of playing to my own strengths. That being said, I'm more than happy to work with, with women with any gender, really, any gender, any age. I have done, and I'm sure I will continue to do so. But it is something that I think needs more people to say, we got to do something about this. So I'm happy to be one of those voices.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant, mate. I think, like you say as well, like going where the demand is, like particularly in the last, I'd say like 2 to 3 years, like I think a lot of like men have realized that like therapy and talking about how they feel is an option for them, whereas they didn't know it was before, because it's not all that long ago that, obviously, Luke, you said it before, like you don't see it in books and stuff anymore, but like Man Up and stuff like that, like that was still very prevalent in society not even that long ago. Like you were mentioning about like films and TV quotes and stuff, like there are TV shows and stuff that are obsolete now that came out only 5 years ago purely for like their views on like gender roles and like men having to be tough and stuff like that. And it's society's kind of coming to a bit of a change now where like it's accepted that men can have emotions beyond like tough, brave, like
absolutely
how they feel.
I would say actually it's gone beyond accepted and it's now expected. And the problem is, and again this kind of feeds back into the previous question and my answer, is that men don't really know how to do that. And I think the reason is that generationally, and I think back, I'm 43, so I'm kind of a bit older, and I do come from a generation where I grew up, and my role models were people like Arnie and Stallone, and it was all it was like action movies, one-liners, all that kind of thing. Lots of testosterone, all the kind of the male characters were emotionally stunted, and they had dysfunctional relationships, and it was all kind of aggression, testosterone, all that sort of thing. And we also had a generation of fathers who were raised by their fathers who come out the back end of the Second World War. So there wasn't this kind of like the behaviour of talking about your feelings was never modelled by their fathers, therefore it wasn't modelled by our fathers. So we've grown up, and all of a sudden, as you pointed out there, the speed at which things have changed, all of a sudden men are kind of like, what? Hold on, we're meant to be able to be sensitive now? Well, how do we do that? And everyone's going, well, come on, be sensitive, cry, talk about your feelings. And there's immense pressure on guys to all of a sudden to do it, but I don't think there's enough help to say, and this is how you do it. And this is a safe space. So these platforms, these communities that are popping up, where guys are getting together and they're talking about, like, let's get men talking, and others, are, I think, a response to that societal expectation that men should be able to do it, because what women have had in therapy for a long, long time is safe spaces. And safe spaces is a phrase that we've heard an awful lot over the last few years. And I think it's fair that guys have safe spaces as well.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, no, of course. And I mean, just to kind of touch on your answer then, so, you know, it has changed a lot in the past 5 years, and we are clearly not doing enough to kind of show people how to open up, and, you know, what to kind of, you know, the things that we, you know, the process of what people need to go to be comfortable enough to be able to do that. But what do you think is the actual like reason for that sudden change in general?
I think it's generational again. I think that younger people today are much more open-minded. I think we're much less bound by, you know, the kind of the generational restrictions that came, you know, when I was growing up. You know, all we've got to look at is, as you pointed out, you know, how our approach to gender roles, and, you know, some of the films and TV programs, as you say, that were kind of not just acceptable, but were kind of encouraged just a few years ago. Now, actually, they're quite outdated and quite ugly and quite harmful. It's a bit awkward to, I mean, a good example would be, and this wasn't really that long ago, would be Friends, the sitcom Friends, which was absolutely massive. And it came in for quite a kicking recently when it was, you know, it started being rebroadcast, and everyone's going, oh, actually, this is quite uncomfortable. There's a lot of homophobia, there's a lot of kind of like stereotypes. So I think that's indicative of how quickly things have moved on. And you've got this whole kind of like woke movement where, you know, everybody is ultra sensitive to things which may cause offence or could be interpreted as being offensive or aggressive. So I think that we are much more sensitive in general, but I'm not sure that we have kept up with that pace of change in terms of meeting the need that's created, if that makes sense. It's a bit of a roundabout answer there, but I guess the internet and social media are another factor in that. You know, I know you wanted to come on to that, so I don't want to jump ahead on there, but I think the connectivity that we have, especially in the last year, in absence of being able to physically be with each other, we've got a much more instant kind of communication approach now, which means information is shared, ideas are shared, things are discussed, opinions are formed and evaluated at a much faster rate than they perhaps were when before the internet and that exchange of information existed.
Yeah, of course. And it's kind of like, you know, there's one idea and then suddenly somebody goes, oh no, this is it, and then this is it, and this is it, and it's like, well, we haven't actually built up properly through those steps. Yeah. But no, it's a great answer, so thank you. I mean, obviously, I mean, I've very much been susceptible, well, on the kind of end of this, and I'm sure Khan has as well, but there's obviously a lot of stigma attached to mental health. There's a lot of confusion in terms of what different diagnoses are, you know, what kind of problems people face day to day. And I also think there is a slight confusion around the terms depression and anxiety. I don't know why I couldn't say that then. That was terrible. But, you know, there's, you know, being depressed, and there's having depression, and there's being anxious and having anxiety. And I think there was a lot of confusion in mental health in general.
Yeah.
But what do you think the kind of main stigmas are, and how do you kind of decipher that confusion?
Yeah, I think you've hit upon one of them absolutely there in terms of the labels that are used and applied. And from a diagnosis perspective, there are many. And I think that they're thrown around by people, they've been kind of appropriated by people to. So here's a great example. I'm sure you maybe even said it yourself, but you've probably heard somebody say it, go, oh, sorry, I'm just a little bit OCD today.
Today.
It doesn't happen. You can't be a little bit OCD. And actually, that's a really harmful kind of use of that particular label that completely denigrates people who do have and have to live with OCD, because people will say that when they just want to tidy things up, or they want to put this there, oh, sorry, that's just my OCD. No, it's not. I'm not saying that people don't have that, but don't feel like that, but people use it in a way which completely devalues it from a diagnostic perspective. And I'm just feeling a little bit depressed today. You know, my anxiety's playing up. I think people have started to use these labels to describe a feeling, and I think that there is a stigma that comes with putting a label on anything. So nobody wants to associate themselves with something that has a negative connotation. So something like depression. You know, are you feeling depressed? Are you feeling anxious? Most people that are feeling depressed or anxious don't know they're feeling depressed and anxious because it's how they're feeling. So I think that there's a lot of confusion and stigma around being labelled, because once you've got a label, it's quite, how am I going to get rid of that? Am I going to be depressed forever, or another one, bipolar? I'm just a bit bipolar.
I hate that one. I'm diagnosed, quite newly diagnosed with bipolar,
Okay.
so cyclothema in particular. But even now I'll get friends and family. They're like, "Oh, you've always been a bit crazy," or I'll get some people that are saying, "Oh yeah, I'm just a bit bipolar at the minute. My moods are all over the place." And it's like, well, if you've had to live through manic episodes or depressive episodes, yes, you could very well be bipolar. But in a general sense of it, just because you've been happy this morning and then a bit pissed off in the afternoon, it doesn't give you the kind of right. And I do find it quite upsetting in a sense. You try to just think, "Oh, they don't mean it like that," but yeah, it's one of those major points, isn't it?
There you go. I'm really glad you shared that, Luke. That wasn't something I was aware of, and you've absolutely nailed it there. I think your reaction there was it must be frustrating. It kind of it is disrespectful to your experience. So I think that that kind of confusion and how people will use those kind of terms or labels without really any understanding of what they're actually representing is definitely one of the things. And the other thing I would say is that we are still very far behind in being able to accept that mental health has the same relevance as physical health. And again, this is a cliche, you've probably heard it before, but if you break your leg or if you hurt yourself, you go to the hospital, you go to the doctor. We've got no problem with accepting that a physical health condition needs attention and that someone is perfectly entitled to take time off work or to convalesce, to take the rest that they need. But when it comes to mental health, there is still a huge stigma around that. And the idea, especially within the workplace, that somebody, if somebody broke their leg at work, then you wouldn't expect them to be in for a bit, or if they did, they'd be in on crutches, and you have this visible indicator that they weren't, that they weren't well, and you would accommodate them. You might hold the door open for them. You might, take extra steps to prepare the meeting room so that they could get around properly. But if somebody had a mental health issue, you wouldn't see it, but also you probably wouldn't be as accommodating of it, or certainly in the past you wouldn't be as accommodating of it because it's invisible. So it's really easy to say, they're just, oh God, they've got another day off, have they? Or, they're off again. We make massive judgments because we need some sort of evidence. We need to see it. If we can't see it, then we think, oh, they're just pulling a fast one, they're blagging it. And I think that is a big problem in people actually speaking up and saying, look, I've got this. This is the way I feel, because they don't feel that they'll be believed.
And I think a big part of that comes from, so I noticed this when I was at towards the back end of school, when I was 15, 16, and all of a sudden every single kid was like, oh, I've got anxiety, I'm depressed. Not every single kid, but it was just popping up more and more, and kids saying they were bipolar, and you got young kids diagnosing themselves with these conditions because it helps them feel better about the way they feel. And don't get me wrong, some of them would have had those conditions, but I think there's been a big wave in society of people deciding that they are this thing. And what we're saying about labels, people get labeled with something and then they decide that's who they are. Mm-hmm. And I think that really takes away from the people who do actually really struggle with it, because it makes it so much harder for them to open up and talk about it, because they don't want to be lumped in with the people who are I don't want to say lying, but exaggerating. Yeah, there you go. And reason, when I shared that post on Let's Get Men Talking, I've never openly spoke about anything, any struggles with my mental health. I've spoken to friends, spoken to my family, but always kept it as close to my circle as possible. And then when I shared that post, the reason I'd never done anything like that before is because I didn't want to be part of that group who are oh, he's just saying it. You know what I mean? It's a scary thing.
It is, and again, thank you for sharing that. I think this is a really complex subject because we're much more willing now, I think, to put our hands up and say, this is how I feel, or, you know, I identify as this, or, you know, I'm going to take ownership of how I feel. And it's very, very difficult to challenge that without it becoming a contentious issue. So I think what you have seen, and, you know, this is very difficult for me to articulate without potentially, again, getting it wrong or causing offense to anybody that's listening, but I believe it's true, so I'll say it. I think mental health has become monetized. You know, it's commercialized. It's there are people out there that are exploiting mental health and people who have mental health issues for their own gain, for commercial gain, to promote their own agendas, because people are now kind of like saying, oh, yeah, that's how I feel. That's how I feel too. And in amongst that, people like yourself who have perhaps struggled and suffered in silence for a long, long time are perhaps getting lost in amongst the people that are flocking to it, because it's a way that they can express something. I'm not saying that they don't feel like that, but it's like anything where it becomes popular. You know, it's kind of like, you know, everybody, you'll always know about when a band becomes really popular and everyone's into them. You're like, I was into that band like from their first album when nobody knew about them, and all of a sudden they get a hit, and everyone's like, oh yeah, I totally love so and so, because it becomes a popular thing. And there's a psychological thing going on there. We gravitate towards it, and I think mental health has fallen into that trap, especially with, as I said earlier, about the emergence of these pages and these platforms, which on one hand provide information to people in a really accessible way and open up those conversations, but on the other hand, they create a kind of a magnet for people to flock to that confuses perhaps some of the real conversations that need to be had. You know, and I'll say it now, there's a lot of pages out there on Instagram that are talking absolute rubbish and that are doing a lot of harm when it comes to mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. No, some really good points, mate. Yeah, thank you very much as well. I mean, there was obviously the most relative topic at the moment is the pandemic. You know, I heard a statistic the other day that 6 million more people have started on antidepressants since the start of the pandemic itself, which, I mean, 6 million is just a horrific number. You know, there needs to be a lot more done, but I mean, what kind of, obviously you're on the ground, so to speak, so what kind of changes have you seen in your work since the start of the pandemic?
Definitely a huge increase in people looking for support. And I think the system, you know, the kind of the route that people would take going to the GP has been broken and overwhelmed for a long, long time. And it hasn't been able to cope with what people have been, the demands that people have been placing upon it. So what's happened over the last 12 months has just put even more pressure on it and has driven more people into private therapy, I think. So one of the biggest changes, or not the biggest changes, the biggest shifts, I think, is that before this time last year, online therapy was happening. It had been happening. It was frowned upon, I think, by a lot of people, more older school therapists, because we're having a conversation right now, and we're used to talking to people. Certainly over the last year, we've talked to people across Zoom or WhatsApp video or FaceTime or whatever. But therapy requires a human connection, and you really need to be in the room with somebody. There's no substitute for that. You're never going to be able to replace that. So a lot of people were very reluctant to advocate online therapy, because you lose a lot of what, from a therapist's perspective, you rely on to kind of make sure you're in tune. So you lose a lot of the non-verbal communication. Like, I can only see your top halves, can't see what you're doing with your hands, can't see what you're doing with your legs. So there's a lot
fidgeting as always.
Oh yeah. So yeah, but if I was working with you, that might help me to know how you felt about a certain thing we were talking about. So there's an awful lot of stuff that's stripped away, but that argument literally evaporated overnight when everything kind of moved online. So a lot of people were forced to be able to go online, and a lot of people who perhaps wouldn't have done it out of choice, now that they didn't have a choice to go face to face, stepped up and did it online. So it literally exploded. A lot of people have had to move their entire practices online, and I think that has really changed the way that therapy works, because and again, it comes back to social media and the digitization, I suppose, of our society, and that therapy has pretty much worked a certain way for most of most of its time, and it didn't really catch up with the pace of change of the world and the things that Carl, you talked about that have happened even over the last 5 years, until it was forced to because of what's happened. And now all of a sudden people are realizing that whilst it's no substitute, online therapy is as effective in a different way, and that it makes that help and support much more accessible. So these increasing numbers of people that would have had to wait weeks or months for an appointment, or might have been affected by mobility issues or transport issues and couldn't physically get somewhere, are now able to access support in a way that was very much in the download before. So I think it's forced a change within how therapy is delivered out of necessity, but it's also opened up a new opportunity that can perhaps meet some of the need that's out there. But this is still mostly happening privately, or more importantly, through volunteers. And there's a big contentious issue around exploitation of newly qualified therapists, because it's not a regulated industry. So anybody can, this is the scary thing, anybody can set themselves up as a therapist. You guys could literally set up a website tomorrow and call yourselves counsellors, and nobody can do anything about it. So this is again why the danger of this stuff being kind of proliferated on Instagram and people taking it as advice or guidance needs to be addressed. But the fact that it's not regulated means that there are membership bodies who hold a lot of power in the sector, and what they do is they have accreditation programs, and they say that in order to be accredited, which is basically getting a gold star, doesn't give you any more knowledge, doesn't give you any more qualifications, but it means that you have to do X amount of hours. So a lot of organisations, a lot of charities, and a lot of voluntary organisations will say, come and volunteer for us, and we will give you the opportunity to have the hours, but we won't pay you. So there's a lot of very skilled, very qualified, very talented therapists out there that are that can't afford to work to rely solely on private practice, and a lot of the jobs within the NHS or within the health and social care system require accreditation. So it's kind of like you've got to go through 3, 4, 5 years of training, which costs a hell of a lot of money, and you've got to go through your own personal therapy, you've got to go through all of this, only to get out the other side to be told that you've then got to volunteer for another 3 years before you've got enough hours. So this huge demand is not being served by creating this kind of bottleneck in the therapeutic world. And then there's people like me who are in a position to be able to practice privately, and I work with people on a sliding scale. So I have a set fee, but I will always keep space within my practice to be able to work with people who can't afford that, because if it gets to the point where I turn somebody down that I can help just for financial reasons, then I've lost my way somewhere.
Yeah, of course. That's no, it's a really good point as well. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, I had no idea about the lack of regulation in that industry.
That's fucking mental.
Yeah, it is pretty scary, and I think it will change in the years to come. There's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, but I think one of the things is if all of a sudden it was a regulated industry, then it would highlight just how underfunded mental health is in this country, and it would put tremendous pressure on the government. So there is at that level, it's very politicized, and that is so far removed from the people that come into therapy, because when people get in touch with a therapist, they are at a point of need. Then they're not like, oh hey, I was thinking I might need some therapy sometime, or in 2 months' time probably gonna need it. They're like, I need it now, because they are at that point of crisis. They might have been carrying what's brought them there for weeks, months, or years, and there are people that take that huge first step and come up against the door being slammed in their face, because they go through the process you would expect. You go to your GP, and the first thing you'll be given is antidepressants, and then you'll be on the waiting list to get a call for an assessment where you might be given a label, and then that label will determine what kind of treatment you get, which will be 6 sessions of CBT, which doesn't really account for all the stuff that I talked about in my model, which is about creating a space for somebody to explore their emotions and actually experience being validated and seen as somebody with worth and value, because that isn't available on the NHS for the most part, because you can't really measure the outcomes and it costs money and and this is where it loses sight of the person when it becomes about money and figures. And we haven't got enough time, so we can go into my feelings on that. So.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, to be perfectly honest, this is the type of topic which me and Khan will revisit on way more than one occasion, I imagine. But
Good.
I mean, we'll go into, I've got a bunch of other points here, but yeah, no, I completely realise we're pressed for time. So let's touch on the social media. Now, the one big thing that I wanted to ask is, and let's summarize it into two key things. But what was your kind of biggest positive that you would say social media can have on mental health, and what's the biggest negative?
So if we're talking about mental health specifically, I would say that they're both the same really, in that the information that's out there and the accessibility of stuff that can kind of explain and help people understand what they think and what they feel, why, is literally at the swipe of a finger or a scroll of your thumb. And traditionally, that information was only held by so-called experts. And I certainly don't consider myself an expert where it comes to the way somebody else feels, because that's, they're the expert.
Yeah.
But traditionally, that information can only be obtained by entering into a kind of a dynamic where you were on the bottom and the expert was there telling you, giving you their knowledge. In the same way that we go to the doctors because we've got a lump here, or this is growing some hairs, or this thing is, causing us a problem. We don't know what it is. Now we can Google it, and pretty much we're all sure that we're going to die because we've got an ingrown toenail. But we go to the
comes off.
yeah, we go to the expert for the expert to tell us what to do. But now you can go online and you can find information that can help you perhaps understand, which is where all of this kind of stuff that's out there can be useful. It can help give people context. So I think that social media has provided access to information in a way which didn't exist before. But then you flip that round and you say the negative, it's provided access to information which, if it's given in the wrong way, if it's badly presented, and if it's accessed by people who actually need, who actually do need the expertise of someone that understands the context that they're looking for that information in, they're doing it in an unsafe way. So this is where advice and therapy differ, in that therapy isn't about giving advice, it's about helping you to figure it out for yourself. And to give someone advice, like I say, when they're at that point of need, telling that they think what they need is for someone to tell them what to do, to how to feel differently or think differently, because they don't know what else to do. That's why they've come there. So if somebody is in that place and they've gone to the GP and they've said, well, it's going to be a 6-month wait to see somebody, and they can't afford personal therapy, and there's nobody in any local volunteer groups, then if they go to social media and they find something and they come across, try these 3 quick tips to fix your mental health, and actually those 3 quick tips, or whatever it is that they're reading, are for that individual not helpful and maybe even harmful, there's no safety net around that person. So they could potentially be doing things which are making things worse for them, because it's being given and received outside of that safe, protected environment that kind of a therapeutic relationship is. So it's a double-edged sword. Social media gives us access to information that can help, but it also gives us access to information that can harm.
Yeah, I think my views on social media are very I flip-flop a lot. I think it's a tool, and it's all about how you use it. It can be very harmful, but it's also just can be really beneficial. I've deleted Instagram and Facebook and then re-downloaded them. I've lost count of how many times, to be honest with you. But I think, it's all about what you use it for. But I think it can be, and in terms of the mental health of young people, it can be such a damaging place. Particularly when I was 16, 17, you very much base your value of yourself on likes and comments and things like that. And I think in terms of education, with social media going the way it's going, it needs to be there needs to be some sort of education on it in schools, because people need to understand what they've got on their phone at the touch of a button. It can shatter a kid's mind state if they see or experience the wrong things on social media, and it's just not really, I don't think it's spoken about enough. And with the world the way it is now, it's something that needs to be looked at for sure.
It is a big one, and I think, just to revisit my answer there, I think I probably was quite specific in answering your question there, Luke, about the sort of the positives and negatives, but what you brought up there kind of is a much broader issue. So we are addicted to these dopamine hits that we get, these validation loops. You know, everybody posts, and what they want is the likes, because we're conditioned to respond to that. You know, it's a Pavlovian thing, and what we have evolved into very quickly is, as you said, basing our self-worth on getting this validation. So if you post something, you don't get enough likes, it doesn't get enough engagement, unless you're, you know, kind of emotionally robust, and you've got a strong sense of self and a strong sense of identity, and you've got healthy relationships, and all of the stuff that that, you know, when we've grown up with a balanced input, we have. If you've got all that, then it doesn't affect you too much. But if you are reliant on that feedback to tell you that you're doing okay, very, very quickly you descend into a very, very dark place, where if you don't get on an almost daily basis, or several times a day, with the way that Instagram works, if you don't get that validation, instantly you're on a very, very slippery slope, because you become addicted to that. And when you don't get it, rather than having withdrawal symptoms from, you know, physical withdrawal symptoms from the drug, you get mental withdrawal symptoms, and those withdrawal symptoms are, I'm not good enough. You know, there's something wrong with me. I'm bad. I'm not worth anything. And from a child's point of view, who hasn't developed properly, as you said, it can absolutely shatter them. And it is doing that right now. People are growing up with more pressure around, you know, their self-worth than they ever have done before. And I think the problem is that it makes too much money for people for it to be stopped.
Yeah, it's I mean, it is a very terrifying thing, you know. I mean, I remember when we did IT lessons back in school, for example, you know, we would learn how to use emails, how to use Word. Most of the time I would just be on, like, I don't know, a game, I don't know, whatever, online. But I think we need to, like what Khan's was saying, I think we do need to integrate social media into, you know, how we are going around our computer usage. And I think it is important because, you know, it's with all of these kind of influencers, etc., and, you know, their whole, if you don't look like them, or you don't have those kind of relationship photos, or you don't have, you know, the designer bags or designer shoes, you know, you fall into this trap of, like you said, I'm not worthy because I haven't got what they've got. And it is just, you know, at the end of the day, it's just instant gratification.
It is. It is. You're absolutely right. It is instant gratification, and it lasts for minutes, seconds at most. You know, when I was at school, it was about trainers. If you didn't have the coolest trainers, then there was something wrong with you. But you take that and you amplify it by, you know, 1,000, and that's where you're at now. And also, what you talked about, those pictures, it's all fake. You know, it's not a representation of reality. But kids don't know the difference. And when like I said earlier about my role models growing up, I grew up thinking that a guy could jump out of a helicopter without a parachute and land, shooting a gun, taking out 200 guys. That was a totally feasible thing for me, because you believe what's put in front of you as a child. And, you know, as you grow up, you realize that's kind of fantastical stuff, and it's just the movies. It's much more difficult these days for kids to tell what's real and what isn't, because it is presented to them as absolutely normal, and this is what you should be like. But it's
for sure. I mean, I'm still kind of confused now that, you know, you can't jump out of a helicopter without a parachute.
Well,
I think it's important for me to say, as a professional, please, if you're listening to this, don't jump out of a helicopter.
It's funny you say about that, like in the films and stuff, because you obviously mentioned earlier, like Arnie. Like, I grew up on like Rocky and Rambo. Like, those are the first like action. Like, I was, from being like 6 years old, I remember being shown those films. I thought from a very young age that's what grown men like look like. So when I got to a certain age, and I was like, well, like, where's my 8-pack at? Why have I not got shoulders the size of my head? Like, why do I not look like Sylvester Stallone? And I didn't realise until like embarrassingly, until I was like 16, I was like, oh, so you don't just like hit puberty and turn into that. Like, that's not what happens to you. Like, it's mad. And like, you do just like think what you see in films will be reality, and now that's what's happening on social media. You think the lifestyles you see presented on social media, like, yeah, that's obviously what's going to happen for everyone. Because if you're young and impressionable, you don't think any different. Like, thankfully,
absolutely.
I'm 23 years old now. I'm at an age where I'm like, just because I see something on social media, I know that's not going to be my experience. But if you are like 10 to 13 years old, you're not going to be aware of that yet.
No, you aren't, and you know it's not as fantastical as the kind of jumping out of the plane or jumping out of the helicopter thing. It's painted as normal life, you know, and body image is a massive thing as well now. When I was growing up, the only people that went to the gym were, you know, kind of rugby guys, or, you know, people that were like powerlifters, you know, or like the odd guy that was, you know, the big guy in the school. But, you know, over the last 10, 15 years, 5 years especially, the obsession with going to the gym is huge. And guys did not go to the gym for the most part when I was growing up. You know, it just didn't exist unless they were, you know, very much into probably usually rugby. Yeah, that was the thing. But the pressure on guys to look a certain way, you know, to be, you know, like single figure body fat and be absolutely ripped and walk around like that whilst still having a social life.
Yeah.
They're going out drinking. But then nobody's talking about the huge steroid problem that sits behind that, and, you know, the unhealthy diets and all the kind of stuff that goes to get that perfect Instagram picture, or you know, or whatever. So there's a lot of pressure on younger people today, massively.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, I know that. Well, just a couple of things, small things now before we start to wrap up. Then, I mean, most importantly, thank you very much for coming on. However, for people that are listening to this that might not necessarily know where to go to find this kind of information out, or if they're at a point of crisis, like, what would you recommend? You know, where would you signpost people to go to if they kind of need immediate support?
Well, I think that's a risky one to be too prescriptive about. So I think the first thing to do, as much as I've kind of talked about the system being broken, is that if you haven't reached out, well, the first thing to do is to talk to somebody close to you, okay? So be it a friend, be it a family member, reach out and just say, listen, I don't feel okay, okay? Just ask them to listen to you, because people are more receptive than you think, okay? And I think that we're becoming more aware of people needing to reach out and ask. So the first thing I would do is find somebody that you trust. Think about somebody that you trust and say, listen, I really need to talk to you. The first thing that you need to do is just get something off of your chest, and that won't make you feel better, but it will start the process. If you haven't got somebody that you feel able to speak to, then there are helplines out there. The one that I would speak to first and foremost would probably be the Samaritans. That's exactly what they are there for, and they will be able to give you advice and guidance about what your next step should be. I would also absolutely advocate going to your GP and speaking to them, because the GPs themselves are, for the most part, absolutely lovely, dedicated, caring people who are not representative of the system within which they work. Okay, so they're not just going to farm you off with pills. There is a process that they've got to follow, but they will also be able to give you information and signposting. If you are in a position where you're able to access private counselling, there are people out there that offer it at reduced rates, and there are also providers who will allow you, or rather give you access to counselling with counsellors in training. Now, these are counsellors that are supervised, that they are only allowed to work with people when they get to a certain degree of competence, but because they are in training, then the fee is much less. And the part of the training requires you to get usually a minimum of 100 hours of client time. So there are many providers out there that are, you know, looking for clients to come in and facilitate that. So you know, that is a route to it. There are other kind of charities out there that offer it. So, you know, quick Google will reveal what is local to you in your area. If you're in a position where you're able to pay for it, then I would say that the two places that you could probably start would be Psychology Today or Counselling Directory, which are, as you know, they sound just directories of therapists. You can search by area, you can search by the type of therapy that they offer, the type of issues that they work with, male or female, and you are then in the driving seat with regards to the type of therapist that you want to choose. And what I would say if you do that is that remember that it is your choice. and that you have to be comfortable, and you should feel comfortable with your choice of therapist. So if you need to go through 2, 3 or 4 until you find somebody that you feel respects you, listens to you and understands you, then that is absolutely your right, okay? Because not every therapist is right for you. So there's different ways in which you can go about it, but the underlying message there is talk to somebody.
Mate, that was, thank you very much as well. I think that's a really, the whole episode has just been a really kind of intuitive and just, it's been a great experience. So thank you very much for your time as well.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Just we'll wrap it up. I mean, unless there's anything you'd like to chime in with, Khan, quickly.
No, I just wanted to say, mate, thank you very much. Like, it's very enlightening. Like everything you've said there is like, I feel like a lot of people can kind of resonate with that, or resonate with them, and they can connect with it as well. And like just saying about like talk to somebody. So I don't know if you experienced this, Luke, but when I did share that post on Let's Get Men Talking, I had a couple people that I would never expect, that I wasn't even particularly close with, who just dropped me a message just to like, not necessarily like share loads, but just kind of say that they were having a bit of a rough time themselves. And like anyone, like I don't know how many like listeners we even have that aren't people we already know, but if there is anyone and like you are really struggling to talk to somebody, like happily drop me and Luke a message. I'm sure Luke can say that as well. Like,
absolutely.
I'll talk to anybody and offer what advice I can. But thank you very much, Richard, mate. It's been a very enlightening conversation.
No, you're welcome. I appreciate your time. Thanks for having me. And, I guess if anybody listening to this does take anything away, it's if you need to talk to somebody, or I'd add, be ready to listen to somebody if they reach out.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, we would love to have you back on again at some point in the future. But most importantly, I really enjoyed that one, and we'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, no, thanks guys. Look after yourselves.
Cheers, and you.
Cheers.